Hello, everyone. This is part one of session 11 of Pre-Socratics to Augustine, also called History of Philosophy 1. We are talking about part 3 of Plato's Meno. And recall at the beginning of the dialogue, Socrates wants to discuss the question of what virtue is, whereas Meno wants to talk about whether it is teachable. And so they initially go with Socrates and they run into these puzzles about how is inquiry possible. And we get the idea that all learning is recollection, but we also get the distinction between knowledge and belief. And then in the third part of the Meno returns to his question. So he's sort of going back to, I wanted to talk about whether virtue is teachable. And you may wonder whether he kind of totally missed the point, because you may wonder whether the recollection story or the recollection theory, depending on how you read it, says that really what you do is you learn something rather than being taught. How do we get knowledge? Not by someone teaching you, but by you learning it in the sense that you recollect knowledge that is latently already in your soul. And then, as we saw in the geometrical example, it would seem that a teacher, let's say someone like Socrates, can play the role of someone who kind of prompts this learning, like kind of helps the student along with raising questions and that kind of thing. But actually, the primary thing is learning rather than teaching. And you could wonder whether, somehow hasn't yet fully gotten this. Now, the third part of the Meno is incredibly famous because it introduces a new method in philosophy. The method is introduced by reference to geometry. So that is a huge innovation. Also, simply kind of in sort of principle terms, philosophy learning something methodologically from geometry. And this method works with hypotheses. So the third part of the Meno can be read as yet another reply to the question of how inquiry is possible, assuming that you either know something or you don't know it. So where can you start? And here's another suggestion. You can start with hypotheses. So you can investigate something which you don't know by coming up with, what seems to you about it with your beliefs, but not taking them as your beliefs, rather taking them as your hypotheses. And then you move from there. And maybe that only gets you to a hypothetical result. So, based on such and such premises, which we don't know to hold, we only hypothetically posit them. But if we posit them, then what follows? That kind of method is developed in the third part of the Meno, and it is a method that has been hugely influential later in Plato's Academy. The academic skeptics, whom we will discuss towards the end of the semester, were quite influenced by that. Our focus now, I'm going to just, mention very briefly one example of how this method works. And then I want to return to this question that I mentioned at the outset, teaching versus learning. So one of the ways in which this method works, and, I should say kind of in parenthesis that part of the Meno is very much under-researched and really difficult to understand. So the kinds of things that Socrates uses as hypotheses may seem to you like, why is that even a hypothesis? So, for example, virtue is something in the soul. Well, if we don't know that, then what do we know at all about virtue? So there are some hypotheses where you would think, why are they even hypothetical? But the point is somehow, and what influences the skeptics is that really nothing, not even things that may seem to you like the most obvious things, none of it is like simply posited. Rather, all of it is treated as merely hypothetical. So one short bit of the final bit of this hypothetical inquiry that Socrates and Meno undertake is that they say, well, if virtue is teachable, then there have to be teachers. But there are no teachers. Hence, virtue is not teachable. So that is just kind of a really brief snippet of how this method works. Now, the homework puzzle that I want you to think about is to kind of dwell a little bit on this question of whether virtue is teachable or learnable. And to kind of give you a little bit of inspiration for that, one of the most influential papers in the past decades, which saw a real revival of interest in ancient ethics, is by Miles Bernier from 1980, and it's called Learning to be Good. And Bernier argues that Plato and Aristotle, in general, the ancient philosophers, take very seriously the idea that maybe we can learn virtue, maybe we can learn to be good. And so there is a question of what would that mean? What would you do if you wanted to learn to be good? So that is the homework puzzle for today, to just sort of genuinely ask yourself, if you entertain the idea that one could learn to be a good person, what could one plausibly do